Good morning, good afternoon, whatever it is you're watching this. Welcome to the continuation of our Summer Topics Bible study. This topic we've been talking about church and society, the relationship of the church, influence of the church on society, on major historical events, particularly on wars in history. And there's probably no greater connection between church and historical event, especially military, than the Crusades. And so that's the topic today. And I'm going to start just giving a little background on Islam, and some of its history. Not so much about the faith itself, but some of the history that led toward the eventual conflict of the Crusades. All three Abrahamic faiths, religious groups, trace their origins back to Abraham. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Islam's roots are in the Arab culture. Arabs trace their ancestry back to Abraham through his first son, Ishmael. Muslims trace their faith history back to Abraham as well. Christians and Jews also trace their faith history back to Abraham. The Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, which it's fair to call it, Christianity saw itself as superseding Judaism, that it was God's will, that they came and kind of took the role of Judaism as the promised chosen people. Islam sees itself also as superseding Christianity in the same way, according to God's will. Muhammad was considered by Islam to be God's prophet, the last in a line of prophets from Judaism through Christianity, also to be God's messenger who received the visions that became the Quran and whose example guides human beings to know the right way to live. He was the religious, political, and military leader of a community state. His teaching and examples took place in response to 7th century Arabian society in which he was born. And that society was polytheistic, tribal, and multicultural. It included Judaism, Christianity, and Zoroastrianism, among others. There was a little sense of cosmic moral purpose or moral responsibility in that particular society, which affected a lot of the ways that Islam developed. Muhammad was born in Mecca in Arabia in 570 of the Christian era, or AD, or the Common Era. He was orphaned at an early age and raised by his uncle, who was a well-respected tribal elder. And though he was illiterate and poor, Muhammad earned his living as a business manager for the caravans of a wealthy widow named Khadijah. Now, Arabia was located between two powerful but fading empires, Byzantia and Persia. There was constant tension between the two empires, also within the tribal life of Arabia itself. Muhammad married Khadijah, his boss. He was 25, she was 40. She was his only wife for the 24 years that they were married. He had the reputation of being honest, having integrity. He regularly retreated to a nearby hillside cave for personal reflection, so he was a spiritual person as well. One night in 610, he received the first of many visions from Allah, God, through the angel Gabriel. This is called the Night of Power and Excellence. Muhammad was commanded to recite what he had heard, to remember it exactly. He continued to receive these visions for the remainder of his life, another 22 years. Having been assured by his wife that he was not crazy, which is always helpful, she became the first convert to Islam, which is an effort to reform Arabian society, much like the Old Testament prophets did in Israel. And the name Islam is very closely related to the word salam, for peace. The revelation to Muhammad was given in the context of a warlike 7th century Arabia, and it enjoyed or received resistance from those in power. After 10 years of persecution and resistance in Mecca, Muhammad and the early Muslims moved to Medina, where Muhammad served as prophet, political ruler, military commander, chief judge, and lawgiver. During those 10 years, Muhammad experienced the night journey in which he was taken by Gabriel to Jerusalem, to the Temple Mount, where he climbed a mystical ladder, encountered prophets from Moses to Jesus, and then encountered God's presence and learned about the Salat, that is the prayer 5 times a day. Eventually, when Muhammad had made some peace with Mecca and the people there, he determined that the Kaaba, which was a house, had actually been a home built by Abraham and Ishmael. He cleansed it of all the gods, kind of exorcised it, and became the destination for Islam's Hajj, that is the pilgrimage. Those are 2 of the pillars of Islam, the Salat, the prayer 5 times a day, and the pilgrimage at least once in your lifetime. Muhammad and Khadijah had 2 sons who died in childbirth and 4 daughters. While in Medina, Islam transformed from a religion only into a political system. Muhammad ruled that community. The system allowed Jews and Christians to live in peace as long as they were loyal and paid a tax. Eventually, hostilities with Mecca led to hostilities between Muslims and some Jews. By the end of his life, Muhammad's army had subdued Mecca and all of Arabia. Clearly, there was not separation of church and state. Muslims believe that the Quran represents both the original and the final revelation of God to humankind, making Islam the oldest rather than the newest of the monotheistic faiths, that what they received predated everything else. The conflict arose at Muhammad's death about his successor. The majority group, called the Sunni, chose his uncle and close friend Abu Bakr, who was most qualified since he had been Muhammad's trusted advisor. Sunni meant followers of the example. That's what that word means. The minority group, called the Shias, thought it should be hereditary succession, and they supported Ali, who was Muhammad's first cousin and his closest male relative. Shia meant party of Ali, and even today the Sunni and the Shia are the 2 main parties within Islam. After several leaders called caliphs, Ali finally became caliph 35 years later, but he was assassinated soon thereafter, and so the frustration. Differences between the Sunnis and Shias are primarily political, not theological. Islam had a history of caliphates or kingdoms or rulers, and the spread of the Ottoman Empire was due to Islam's growth and spread. Muhammad's death in 632 led to a split in Islam, the Sunnis representing about 85% of Muslims, and the Shias representing most of the rest. The first 4 leaderships after Muhammad were called the 4 rightly guided caliphs, the successors to Muhammad. And in this time, they lived simply and faithfully. Later caliphs, however, lived like kings and emperors with opulence, and eventually a caliphate became hereditary. The Umayyad dynasty, 661 to 750, emerged from the remnant of the Persian and Byzantine Empire. During this dynasty, the transition from rightly guided caliphs to imperial Islam happened. Wealth and success and power brought conflicts with traditional Arab ways of life. We see this in other faiths and other groups as well. So there were several splits in Islam, including the Shia split. The dynasty ended after a slave revolt in 750 AD, which led the way to the Abbasid Empire, 750 to 1258. So through most of the Crusades, they were a wealthy and powerful Islamic community. Great cultural achievements, strong central government marked the Abbasid Empire. With the Abbasids, there were great contributions to the law, to theology, to art, to philosophy, literature, medicine, math, science, and architecture. They learned from and extended the teachings of the ancient Greek philosophers. They influenced Europe as it began to emerge from the Dark Ages. The splintering of Islamic culture was affected by the Crusades from, say, 1095 to 1453. The Christian versus the Islamic confrontation still colors the relationship today. So Islamic expansion threatened the West. The Crusades ended in 1453 when when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks. Later Islamic empires, the Persian Safavid, 1501 to 1722, and the Indian Mughal, 1520 to 1857. Don't worry, there won't be a test later on this. The decline of Islam and Islamic empires kind of parallels the rise of Western European colonial expansion. And the modern emergence of Islamic power, the Iranian Revolution, the Arab Spring, terrorist jihad. Terrorism, most Islamic scholars will tell you, is a perversion of Islam and a reaction to Western colonialism, especially following World War I and World War II. And we will talk about those some in subsequent studies. Western Christianity's papacy had declined significantly in power by about the year 1000. So we're going back just a little bit here, about 1000 AD, after the first millennium of Christianity. And around that time, the Gregorian Reform movement marked a resurgence. Also, there was a schism, a split with Byzantine Christianity, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, over the issue of papal supremacy. And finally, in 1054 AD, there was the official split. And the straw that broke the camel's back was something called the Filioque controversy. Without getting into that, it was a phrase that was inserted by the Roman Church into the Creed, which gave equal power to the Son, God the Son, in terms of creating the Holy Spirit. And the Orthodox Church, that was not part of the original Creed. They didn't want to change it. They didn't agree. They thought that gave more power to the Pope. Anyway, finally split 1054. The Crusades were a series of religious wars. They were initiated, supported, and sometimes directed by the Roman Church, the Pope, also called the Latin Church because they spoke Latin. The Eastern Mediterranean campaign, the first one, between 1096 and 1271 AD, the goal was to recover Holy Land from Islam. This was a series of conflicts. Those campaigns were considered a penitential exercise, which means that if you participated, if you went as a crusader, it would result in the forgiveness of your sins. The crusaders that believed they were fighting a holy war for God and for their own salvation. So Pope Urban II proclaimed the First Crusade at the Council of Clermont in 1095 AD. The military support for the Byzantine Empire against the Turks there was also an armed pilgrimage to Jerusalem. These were all parts of the Crusades, supporting the Eastern Orthodox against the Arab Turks or the Islamic Turks. Also, that armed pilgrimage to Jerusalem. They went to Jerusalem, the holy city. There was enthusiastic popular response, public vows to join the crusade. Some believed that there would be a mass ascension in heaven at Jerusalem, that's how the crusade would end. Some believed that, and they were told that their feudal debts, other service obligations under the medieval system would be satisfied. They would be free, financially and socially free to pursue their lives. Opportunities also were there for fame and fortune or political advantage, and that was very encouraging for many of the knights who went. The results of the First Crusades were the establishment of 4 Crusader states in the Near East. The post-Crusade presence remained until about 1291. Lots of dates. After this series of crusades that ended in 1291, there were no subsequent crusades designed to recover the Holy Land. The resurgence of Islam resulted, though, in a call for a second crusade in 1146 by Pope Eugenius III. The great French abbot Bernard of Clairvaux actually proclaimed that the loss of territory due to this Islamic resurgence was due to their sin. So very much the way a lot of the Old Testament, the book of Judges, and all that understood. So much of that military defeat was due to moral failing and sin. There was another Cistercian monk named Rudolf who preached anti-Semitism, and that stirred violent crusading activity and resulted in the massacre of many Jews in the Germanic states. The Second Crusade had the active support of Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany, but this crusade, unlike the first, ended in failure. So very quickly, the Third Crusade resulted again from Islamic expansion in the Middle East in 1189. Pope Gregory VIII declared the Third Crusade, which was a miserable failure, until the French and English arrived and turned the tide, and the result was a negotiated peace. The Fourth Crusade, declared by a newly elected Pope Innocent III, was actually largely financed by Venetian merchants, and they were and expected to be repaid by profits from the victory. The seizure of the Christian city of Zara led to the excommunication by Crusaders by the Pope. So the Christian Crusaders actually seized and captured the Christian city of Zara. And as a result, the Pope excommunicated them, though I think he rescinded the excommunication of the French for some reason. Eventually, the Muslim forces laid siege to Constantinople, resulting in the deaths of a sizable percentage of the Greek Orthodox Christian community. The Fifth and Sixth Crusades became increasingly about financial goals, trade, etc., under the guise of religious piety. Finally, the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans in 1453. The response of the Crusades at that point, after that fall, just became largely symbolic. Pope Innocent III began the practice of proclaiming against Christian heretics, political warfares that were called crusades. And in the 13th century, the Cathars in Languedoc and against Bosnia were called crusades, but they were not in that sense. Really, after the First Crusade and then something of the Second and Third, the Crusades were a miserable failure. In the 15th century, the efforts against the Waldensians in Savoy and the Hussites in Bohemia, the famous Jan Hus, who was executed, and his followers in Bohemia, there was an uprising there, and the fight against them was considered a crusade. And in the 16th century, armed conflict by the Catholics against Christian Protestants. The animosity between Christianity and Islam was fostered by the Crusades, and it helped form the foundation for the conflict and the violence that we've seen in our own modern time. The issues are often political, social, economic, but they are wrapped in the guise of a religious fervor. The motives of politics, power, and money have often been wrapped in the guise of religious conflict to justify many atrocities. And in this spirit, we will continue next time to look at what happened on the outgrowth of the Crusades and these other conflicts that led to World War conflict in the early 20th century. Thank you so much. God bless.